Good morning and welcome to the 6th Transboundary Grasslands Partnership Workshop. I am Carolyn Gannett, the manager of the Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP, and I will be the moderator for the workshop this morning. I was also the chair of the Transboundary Grasslands Partnership, and my term just ended last month, and we'll be hearing from the Transboundary Grasslands Partnership's new chair, Kevin Ellison, in a few minutes. I would like to start by stating that we respectfully acknowledge that the Transboundary Grassland Partnership works within a geographic area that has been peopled and stewarded by unique, distinct, and prosperous groups of Indigenous peoples. For centuries, colonization, invasion, and dishonesty have resulted in the displacement of these people from their spiritual and cultural homelands and the lands reserved to their sovereign rule by treaties. I'm currently in Regina, Saskatchewan, in Treaty 4 territory, which includes the territories of the Nahiawak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis or Michif Nation. They have worked to protect these landscapes and the life that these areas sustain. As part of our land acknowledgement today, I would like all of our participants to this week to do your own land acknowledgement in your location. Thank the land for all the gifts and lessons it has provided. Sasha, can you go to the next slide? And if you don't know, please learn what treaty lands you're on and be cognizant of the First Nations people that were the original stewards of the land who continue to occupy these territories. This is a great resource that Sasha shared with the Planning Committee. You might already know it. It's a digital map by the Native Land Digital. The digital map shows territories, languages, and treaties. It's a neat resource to explore and learn more. And in light of learning more, it's important for each of us to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on the land, how we've benefited from the colonization of this land, to seek to understand our place within that history, and find a way to contribute to reconciliation now and into the future. And I think we can all work on that. We are grateful that you all took the time to join us today. We're also very appreciative of all our speakers who agreed to present this week. We have a great lineup over the next few days. Next slide. So just a few housekeeping items. In case you're unsure, your camera and microphone are off, so no one can see you as an attendee. We have 3 presentations today under the theme of Global Vision. So these are big picture presentations about strategies, frameworks, and approaches. We have an hour in the schedule for each presentation slot, so each presentation will be 30 to 40 minutes, and we should have lots of time for questions. If you have a question, please type it in the question box in the GoToWebinar dashboard. The questions will be moderated at the end of the presentation as time allows. And so we'll try to get to as many as possible. If you have a technical concern, please send a question to the organizers and someone will advise you as soon as possible. Most presentations will be recorded with the exception, I think, of Rachel from Environment and Climate Change Canada, which is the last presentation today. The recorded webinars will be available on the Transboundary Grasslands Partnership webpage, on the Alberta PCF website, or their YouTube channel in the near future. At the end of the week, you'll receive a survey. Please make sure to complete the survey. If there's anything you would like to note in the survey, you can make a note during the week so that you don't forget. We really appreciate input from our participants so that we can keep improving the workshop every year. Now I'll pass it over to Kevin Ellison, who is the new chair of the Transboundary Grasslands Partnership, to go over a bit about the TGP and its history. For those of you who are new to the group and the workshop, we're always looking for more groups to join the partnership. So welcome, Chairperson Kevin.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you for your work as chairperson ahead of me. Yes, this will be the first time we have a Montana chair, and first I should say welcome everyone to this virtual conference. I'm very glad in hindsight that we made this a virtual conference. Obviously a transboundary conference, it's a little hard to meet when borders are closed to certain people. So it's nice that we are able to have this virtual platform. We'll miss mingling and handshaking, but at least we don't have to travel and can see a lot of great talks and fit that into our schedule, especially with the recording option. Yeah, as Carolyn mentioned, the Transboundary Grassland Partnership is hosting its 6th workshop here. All I can say is, man, we've come a long way. Back in 2016, the first meeting was held in Elkwater, Alberta, in the Cypress Hills. More of put together by Albertans as a conservation forum, just to query groups in the transboundary area about getting together and discussing conservation. And really it's evolved into a wide-ranging group, even though we have a pretty tight geographic focus, really focused on the Milk River watershed basin there. As you can see in this map, kind of fuzzy boundaries as we have more and more participants, but from that first workshop where we had about 40 participants and really good representation from about 30 groups, we now have over about 100 groups participating at different times across the moving workshops. And I'd like to often point out that the transboundary part of the name is really true in many different senses, more than just political boundaries. We also are kind of meeting with people across different expertise that we often wouldn't run into normally, and a lot of learning back and forth across political borders as well as finer scale borders as well. And that's really goes to about how this was formed around looking at issues that don't stop at the border. Certainly biology, economics don't necessarily stop at the border. Policies change, but that's something that we also meet and discuss as well. But the group formed after that meeting in 2016 and developed a vision, and all the statements you see here. The vision is to work collaboratively to sustain healthy transboundary native biodiversity and the supporting grassland ecosystems and communities. I think that latter part makes us a little unique. We do have a lot of broad fora groups that you'll be hearing some about today, like the Central Grasslands Roadmap, the Joint Venture 8 group that does work in a transboundary fashion, but I feel that this group is more at a mid-level at its regional focus, but also in themes as well, looking at not only biology, but also communities and how those sustain grasslands as well. True to our transboundary nature, we have a rotating workshops, as you can see in the second bullet there. The workshops have moved throughout the jurisdictions annually so that we're able to cover the full region and have more complete participation. That's also mirrored by our core team that does our planning for workshops and monthly meetings. So if you're interested in joining or participating, or how you can learn more, the Alberta PCF website that we've provided the link for, and will during the talks today, after talks where the recordings are, is a great resource for looking at lists of participants, as well as looking at past workshops and attendees. So I'm hopeful that you'll enjoy the talks today, and hopefully that they'll stimulate good discussion and thoughts about different ways we can work and collaborate together and leverage each other's work. That's certainly been one of the main fruits of this organization, has been new collaborations, new viewpoints on how to tackle problems, also some tie-ins to new sources of funding, and then also groups helping each other with letters of support and access to different data and basic information. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Carolyn, who will be the moderator for the first day's talks.
Thanks, Kevin. That was great. We are going to do a quick poll just to see where everyone is from. Sasha, did you want to launch that poll now? And so as a participant, you have a few minutes to fill out the poll. Not a few minutes, maybe a few seconds. I think that's good, Sasha. I think it's stayed pretty steady. And these are the results. So we have about 10% from Montana, 40% from Saskatchewan, 36% from Alberta, 7% from somewhere else in the United States, and 7% from somewhere else in Canada. And so if you would like to tell us in the chat where you're from the other categories, that would be great. We like to hear where everyone is from. Yeah, so that's awesome. So thanks for doing that. First up for our presentations, the first presentation will be on the Central Grasslands Roadmap with Tammy Verkotteren and Christian Artuso. Here is a bit about our presenters. Tammy earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Wildlife Management from Michigan State University and a master's degree from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She began working for Bird Conservancy in 1999, first in landowner outreach for the Prairie Partners program, then as the outreach director. She has served as executive director since 2008. Tammy is also the NABCI Human Dimensions Subcommittee Chair, as well as chair of the Playa Lakes Joint Venture and co-chair of the Northern Great Plains Joint Venture. Tammy believes in relationships with people that will make a positive difference for conservation now and in the future. Dr. Christian Artuso is a conservationist and ornithologist with the Migratory Birds Division of the Canadian Wildlife Service. He focuses on the conservation of migratory birds and grassland ecosystems. He currently chairs the Canadian Working Group of the Central Grasslands Roadmap Summit and is an invited expert on grasslands for the Commission of Environmental Cooperation. Christian also sits on the Bird Specialist Subcommittee of the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, or CSIWC, and is involved in various conservation initiatives in Canada and internationally. In addition to having coordinated the Manitoba Breeding Bird Atlas, he is a committee member of the Manitoba Important Bird Area Program, the Manitoba Chimney Swift Initiative, the Delta Marsh Bird Observatory, and Nature Manitoba. He has published many articles and received the Cliff Shaw Award for Outstanding Contributions to the Blue Jay, so Nature Saskatchewan's peer-reviewed journal. And Christian received Nature Manitoba's Ernest Thompson Seton Award in 2020. So welcome, Tammy and Christian.
Thank you, Carolyn. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, I just first wanted to start out with a land acknowledgement. I'm from Colorado, so I'm on the traditional lands of the Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne. On behalf, though, of the Central Grasslands Roadmap planning team, Christian and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and of course, a special thank you to Sasha and Carolyn. We look forward to sharing about this collaborative conservation strategy. Christian and I will be tag teaming the talk with you today. So all of you are obviously with the Transboundary Partnership, you know about the beauty of collaboration. So the point of the roadmap is the fact that together we can achieve new heights and be more effective in grassland conservation. All of you here today are champions, your levers, your partners, your key leaders for the future of our grasslands. We want each of you to think about the work and the broader work of the partnerships that we have and ways we can complement our daily activities, our annual goals, and ultimately achieve more. So as we move forward, I want us to all challenge ourselves to think outside the box, think outside of our jurisdiction, how we achieve better private, public, and indigenous land conservation, and how we can be a spark and a catalyst for conservation the community can sustain and shepherd. Together, we can change the paradigm of our grasslands from declining and degraded to thriving, our grassland bird populations from the most at risk to stable and long-term sustainability, and our human communities from struggling, running out of water, trying to adapt to climate and changing landscapes, to healthy and resilient people making a living and thriving. The planning team for the Central Grasslands Roadmap effort has been meeting for about 18 months. We have more than 30 members representing 8 sectors that live and work in the Central Grasslands, including non-government, state, federal, academia, indigenous, industry, foundations, and private landowners. And of course, we have participation and representation from our 3 countries of Canada, US, and Mexico. We work under a constellation governance model, so it's a shared ownership model. The steering planning committee is keeping the work moving forward, and Bird Conservancy has just been serving as the catalyzing organization and convening organization. We actually have a professional facilitator that's been working with us for over 18 months to create the tools and to help move the efforts forward and keep us coordinated. And you'll see that there's different working groups, and they connect back to our shared vision, goals, and objectives. They focus on more relevant priorities in the roadmap for these working groups. These working groups include industry, foundation, metrics, landowner, policy, federal, and you'll see different leaders for the different groups from the planning team, including World Wildlife Fund, private industry, and Audubon Rockies for policy, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for funders, Christian for the Canada Working Group, and then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Forest Service for federal agencies. This effort has been made possible by many partners and sponsors, including the Knobloch Family Foundation and ConocoPhillips. We also have support from foundations and non-governmental organizations and state agencies as well. And we'll be looking to pursue additional partners and funders as we come together for the summit in May 2022. So hopefully some of you have actually already participated in the virtual summit, which happened in July and August of 2020. We started off with a survey out to participants to get a sense of priorities and needs for the community and help create the foundation for the virtual summit. We've had now over 250 participants from 150 organizations, and that number has increased to over 400 folks and over 200 organizations since we started. There's 3 panels that set the stage for the meetings on science gaps, needs, issues, indigenous communities, perspectives from Canada and Mexico, as well as initiatives and policy. We then got into 2 working sessions around the themes of partnerships and engagement, research and evaluation, and policy and funding. We wanted to make sure that we had leadership engagement, so they reacted to some of the efforts that we were elevating from our working groups, and they gave us direction and feedback. We got into groups one more time, and then 150 pages of notes were condensed down to 4-page summary to give us that 30,000-foot level, and we ended there in 2020. So now we've been very intentional about getting more regional, state, and local input for on-the-ground efforts in 2021. And what we saw from those 12 priorities that were identified, there's 4 big buckets. So we want to help elevate and support local initiatives and collaboratives. We want to catalyze and pilot efforts that can inform the next Farm Bill, which is relevant here in the US. Want to get conservation on the ground and community engagement, and addressing priority needs that are relevant at the community level. This includes working with land trusts, landowner cooperatives, grazing coalitions, tribal and federal lands, being part of a greater solution for grassland conservation. Ways to think of land beyond our administrative boundaries and help support adjacent lands and scale up our efforts. We also helped this be a forum for giving input to the North American Grasslands Act, so Western voices were included. Also an opportunity to help elevate the need and opportunity with Recovering America's Wildlife Act for support. In terms of policy, addressing limitations and needs in Farm Bill, from economic incentives to resilient landscapes, to also elevating the value of native grasslands, keeping grass side up. And then the importance of communications and messaging to elevate grasslands, and they're important to our environment, our food, our well-being, the quality of air and the water that we drink, and the need for marketing and sustainable products. And helping people connect to each other, from trainings to information exchange, getting larger data on grasslands, wildlife, and people together to help tell the story of the region, to help get our maps to reinforce instead of create confusion, so we can integrate data. And then trainings. We saw a lot of interest in trainings on engaging with Indigenous communities, landowners, helping with trust and relationships, and also the relevancy of our efforts in different cultures, honoring local knowledge, honoring Indigenous knowledge. So in 2021, it's again taking that 30,000 foot level and getting more to the grassroots. Leveraging with other initiatives like the Great Plains Framework, which you'll be hearing about later with Duroc, and the JV8, and ensuring that the work is nested, scalable, and relevant on the ground. And having intentional conversations from state wildlife agencies to the Natural Resources Conservation Service to landowners and Indigenous leaders. We visited with the South Dakota Grassland Coalition, Rancher Stewardship Alliance, Missouri Conservation District. We also put out a landowner survey. We have a landowner advisory group helping inform the work. We want to help capture the biggest barriers and innovative ideas and solutions from landowners for more local collaborative conversation. Real quick, I just wanted to highlight some of the results that came from the survey that we did in the US. The purpose of this survey was to ensure priorities identified in the roadmap support ranchers, landowners, and producers, and topics focused on gathering information on existing programs, how they're working, opportunities for future programs, and communication needs. We had 153 respondents across the 10 flyway states, and right now we're in discussions with partners in Canada about pooling information up there, also looking at the opportunity for a survey in Mexico. So here's just some quick answers or responses that we got. They were asked 3 questions to understand their perceptions of metrics for programs to track. And economic metrics were huge, including annual yield and net profit, but also ecosystem metrics. They really care about bird population rates and understand that they're in decline. Also carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and soil health. And then rangeland and operations, including operation resiliency, breeding calving success, and livestock health. In terms of future programs that they would like to see, programs that focus on the ecosystem, topsoil improvement and conservation to proactive management, carbon sequestration, and programs for small producers. They also want education programs on sustainable management. And they really want to see educating the general public regarding the stewardship efforts of landowners, integral to the health of grasslands and management through livestock. The complete report is available on our website at www.grasslandsroadmap.org. So beyond the surveys and beyond these more local meetings, we've really been trying to keep momentum and energy going. So we have to go high and we also have to go kind of mid-level and local. So we want to ensure we're working with a network of partners. We're elevating grasslands at the national and international scales while also getting input as we scale down a community. So the trilateral in May 2020, the 3 countries, Canada, the US, and Mexico, all the tables identified grasslands as of greatest priority. So right now, Canada, the US, and Mexico are working on a letter of intent that will be signed in May of 2022. They're trying to make sure that those efforts keep going. We've also been working with federal partners on an MOU for them to elevate grasslands in the US as a priority across our country. And we're shooting for signing at the Department of Interior, Department of Ag, and Department of Defense levels. Are there similar opportunities that could be replicated in Canada as well as in Mexico? All of you are familiar with America the Beautiful and reading Biden's administration policy into how to achieve in a private-dominated landscape, elevating voices and messaging from landowners to the non-government organizations about the importance of Farm Bill, joint ventures, indigenous rights, keeping grass side up, how to help implement 30 by 30 in a working landscape model and create it as opportunities instead of fear. And also recognizing that the importance of our countries, birds, other wildlife, they don't stop at our borders. Supporting the North American Grasslands Act and getting word out to other organizations to consider endorsing. The bill is in development as we speak. It includes grasslands and sagebrush, and it also includes a separate pot of funds for Indigenous communities. Canada is making lots of great progress on Indigenous engagement strategies. They're a key part of the 30 by 30. We need to broaden our Western ways. We need to recognize and accept Indigenous knowledge, values, culture. We need to address access and barriers, and we need to build relationships and trust. Need continued engagement, and we need to work with respect, equity, and empowerment in finding those shared values and blending conservation and Indigenous culture. Work groups have also formed in Canada and Mexico to define and prioritize the application of the roadmap in their countries. Mexico had their first meeting in spring, and they're preparing to have another meeting this winter, and sharing the results and getting ready for the meeting as we come together next May 2022. So I'm going to turn this over to Christian so he can share a little bit more about the Canada Working Group.
Christian, you're still muted.
Well, somebody had to do that. I guess I'm the first. Sorry, folks. I'll start again. Christian Artuso with Canadian Wildlife Service. Thanks very much for this. Today I am living in Ottawa, which is unceded Algonquin territory, or Anishinaabe Waking, and that's where I'm speaking to you from today. As Tammy mentioned, I chair the Canada Working Group, and it's really a great opportunity to give you a little perspective on our efforts in Canada to be part of this giant, big process here. So I want to say right off the bat that the past 2 years have been a really great experience for me. I see basically two main efforts in my role, and that is to firstly to try to elevate the cause of grassland conservation. Obviously working for the federal government, that includes internally within our leadership if I can, as best I can, but also outside of government, of course. And also I really like to try to build bridges, and everything about grassland conservation, everything about working landscapes is very interdisciplinary. We need to form a lot of partners with all sorts of different peoples to make this a reality. And I would say the Grassland Roadmap Summit in particular has been a wonderful opportunity to bring so many diverse voices from all sorts of different aspects of life in Canada to this question of grassland conservation, and to elevate those voices, basically make us squeakier wheels. We have a lot of very experienced people in our group, and many of them have been saying that this, it's wonderful to see these stars aligning in this way, that this seems to be a great moment in time for grasslands. There are, our Canadian Working Group is fairly small. It's only about 20 or so members, but nonetheless, we have a lot of interconnections with other groups and linkages there. So, for example, it's awesome to have Kevin from the Transboundary participating in the Canadian Working Group and keeping those linkages alive. We've even been able to use this as a way to raise some funds. So I've been able to get some internal money for some contracts, which I'm extremely pleased about. So as part of basically the Canadian Working Group's meetings and choosing which among the strategic priorities identified in the Roadmap Summit we'd like to focus on, we have been able to get a First Nations engagement contract with CIER, that's CIER, which stands for the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. CIER is helping us to reach out to First Nations across the geography and to bring those voices to the table, which we hope will do a couple of things. One is to lead to even more participation in the in-person summit in Colorado next year. We've already had so much wonderful Indigenous participation in this process, but we're looking to strengthen that even more. And secondly, also, we hope, that that might lead to some of the knowledge exchange and sharing with some of the wonderful Indigenous conservation initiatives in the States. I'm sure you're familiar with G4G, Grasslands for Generations, or the former Buffalo Nations Grassland Alliance, for example. And then we also have a contract around communications, and many in our Canadian working group are particularly passionate that we need to get to work on the communications aspect of grasslands to a broad public, for them to understand what all this complex, stuff that we talk about in grasslands is. So we're just beginning that process now to develop some key communications messaging, which will be non-proprietary, available to all the members, all the delegates of the Canadian Working Group, and we're liaising a little with the communications working group of the main roadmap summit as well, as we go to ensure that we're working in sync in parallel. And if you could go on to the next slide, Tammy. Now, there's a lot going on, both in government and in the NGO world and in Indigenous-led conservation. So really, there's a lot to align with. The roadmap is not sort of replacing any of these, but we are trying to work in parallel with. For example, in federal initiatives include the priority sectors, which is extremely important, and the agriculture priority sector in particular. Also priority places. There's also a lot right now under Nature Smart Climate Solutions. You've probably heard announcements about that in the recent past. Those include some really interesting things, such as a grassland inventory, standardizing a grassland inventory across Canada, which actually links to some of the great ongoing provincial initiatives. There are some wonderful provincial initiatives around grasslands, including grassland inventory work and really improving our ability to measure loss and conversion of grasslands, to be able to do that from Earth observation from space. And a lot of progress is being made there. So I think the summit is one of the platforms that's helping us align those efforts. And I mean, ultimately, we would really love to see that work in a way that would be informative for internationally. There's also a lot going on in species at risk, and you'll hear about the pan-Canadian approach later today. And we're also in discussion with, for example, Species at Risk Recovery Group, who are also involved in a lot of Indigenous consultation and engagement on species at risk at the moment. So we're combining efforts there. And I mean, and on Thursday, you'll hear about some of the wonderful Indigenous-led conservation initiatives that are ongoing. And we're also trying very hard, both through the contracting and other ways, to link with those, to work in parallel with those. It's kind of a question, I feel, of unity and strength. And I would borrow in fact, I'd borrow the Haudenosaunee cluster of arrows analogy for that from the Great Lore of Peace. One arrow easily snapped in two, but a cluster of arrows tied together is too strong to break. So it's really about working in parallel and recognizing all that's going on. And even I'm sure I'm leaving out things as I go through this. It's hard to do these talks without them becoming a bit of a laundry list. If you could move on to the next one for me, Tammy. So in addition to all of that, there's so many other things, some of them, of course, which have been mentioned already today. The Transboundary is a fantastic initiative. And I really like what Kevin said about regional level, mid-level, and the big picture working together simultaneously, and how both are so important. It's so important to have the place-based stuff and the on-the-ground stuff, as well as this 30,000 feet initiative. So we're trying to do just that. And I think having a Canadian working group is helping me try to see the big picture and helping many others as well. The JV8 was already mentioned. That's the 8 joint ventures working from the Sonoran and the Rio Grande joint venture that straddle the border of Mexico and the United States, and including the PHJV, or the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture in Canada. I'm sure many of you are aware of that. In fact, you may have even seen a webinar from Tammy and myself and one of the PHJV webinar series recently. We have some interesting discussions with the PHJV, and in fact, we even have some new proposals around human dimensions, and it's really great to see the strategic objectives of the PHJV, including a lot of grasslands focus right now, and it's great to be part of that discussion. And I think, again, the summit mechanism is helping us there. There's also the CEC, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. And some of you who have been around for a long time will know that the CEC once gave us the GPCAs, that's the Grassland Priority Conservation Areas. And the CEC is again looking at grasslands. So I've been linking in the summit with that. And it is, it's encouraging that the Roadmap Summit is on the CEC radar for the next iteration. And then, of course, up in Canada, there's a lot of interest in the NAGCA proposal, the North American Grassland Conservation Act. So again, this is a space for us. The working group has been a space for us to discuss this, talk about this, engage with the PHJV. And in fact, even for me, this is getting attention of my senior management. So this is a really, really significant in terms of the squeakier wheel aspect of this. So Magwechseka Kanawaya, and I'll pass it back to you, Tammy.
Thank you so much, Christian. It's really been a pleasure to get to work with you and appreciate your leadership. Everyone still hear me okay, I hope? So wanted to touch base now on what we're working on in these next several months as we build toward the summit next year. So building off of discussions, we recognize the need to bring ourselves together. There's 4 different bird lists out there at least, including the BCC, Partners in Flight, Species of Greatest Conservation Need, Road to Recovery. So can we simplify that and identify our top 20 or so species that can help bring us together? These species we'd want to make sure they're covering species that are in greatest declines, species that cross different geographies, have different habitat needs, species that people can identify and bring people to the table. So we're looking at species that cover those different bases and include songbirds, waterbirds, shorebirds, and waterfowl. Also making sure that we do have upland species in there, including grouse and quail. So this meeting will be happening October 27th and 28th. We realize that consensus is hard, but hopefully we can get alignment. And then ultimately, can we work together and think about ways to turn the trajectories around and get to stable in 20 years, if not increasing, while also keeping common birds common. And then starting to get into, can we get an idea of estimate of acres it will take, using the joint ventures and habitat objectives and population targets as part of our equation and effort. And then working collaboratively. We want to, Barry Robinson with the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture has been doing some great modeling work. Can we expand that modeling work across the 8 JVs in the next 6 months in preparation for the summit? And can we also get a parking lot of research priorities that, you know, we don't want to get mired down on what we don't know, but the information is important. We need to move conservation forward and continuing to advance our knowledge too on where we have gaps. And then also this meeting will bring in principles of social science. We understand threats and needs. It's ultimately going to take working with people to address those and come up with solutions. We definitely want to have that as part of the equation and conversations as well. We're also working on putting together a grasslands forum. There's been a lot of stories here about on National Public Radio about cattle, climate, and the future. So we've been in discussions with Colorado State University and the Center for Collaborative Conservation, the Salazar Center, and the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. We really want to focus in on urban and suburban audiences and have a 4-part series where we talk about where are our grasslands, where are they worldwide, where are they right out our back doors, what are threats that their communities and our grasslands are facing, from our wildlife to our people to our lands. And then showcase a local case studies. The city of Fort Collins and Larimer County, they've put together 50,000 acres. They've got bison, black-footed ferrets, local grazing association, a diversity of birds and other wildlife out there. And they're also leveraging those investments and supporting work in Mexico. So, and then ultimately, we also want to have the different partners that are working with ranchers talking and sharing. Why are we working with ranchers? What does this mean for grasslands and health of grasslands and wildlife and population? We expect this 4-part series to take part in February and March 2022, and we hope to see others replicate this model north and south. We're also working on, Christian talked a little bit about this, and a big need that came up was, again, on this idea of grasslands, why they matter. You know, being in Colorado, people think of the mountains, but nearly half of our state is grasslands. People don't realize that they live within a grassland complex, and we want them to realize the communities right out their back doors. And it's important to their health and their well-being, from the air to water to their cultural values. We also have been working on a sustainable grasslands policy. There's a working group that's headed up by Audubon Rockies and looking at addressing policy, succession planning, and elevating Indigenous voices, incorporating policy with nature-based climate action and focusing on our countries, and then rural economic and ecological health. Increasing funding for what works, from joint ventures to the Neotrop Act, to encouraging more folks to get engaged with the North American Grasslands Act. And you can go to #ActForGrasslands to learn more, and ultimately unifying our voices about the need for grasslands. So we're working to come together in May of 2022. We want to make, everyone talked about how the virtual summit was good, but we really need time together. We need to build more bridges, build more relationships and trust. So we'll break into sectors and we'll identify kind of what are our priorities the next 1 to 3 years. And then we'll have discussions across teams to validate and challenge each other, and get to formalizing the roadmap and measures of success and committing to making those measures happen. And we want to make sure that we can report out on success. Can we keep communications and coordination going for at least the next 10 years? And using different collaborative models like the Transboundary meeting, the biannual National Grasslands meeting that National Wildlife Federation puts together to stay connected, to talk about what's working and address challenges. And then ultimately, we want to nominate a team to steward this effort forward for at least the next 10 years that represents the 8 sectors in the 3 countries. So I did want to talk a little bit about the JV8. We are working in close coordination. We are kind of stood up about the same time. The 8 migratory joint ventures are unified in the conservation of central grasslands, along the breeding to the wintering grounds, and sharing on their shared conservation strategies for grassland birds and communities. And of course, building on the strengths of the JV model to forward full life cycle conservation efforts. There is a big focus with the land stewardship and private lands, obviously a huge human culture piece here. Strong connection to getting conservation delivered on the ground. That's what the joint ventures do well and do great through partnerships. And then leveraging partners and funders for effective conservation. And Christian already highlighted the 8 joint ventures that are part of the JV8. So you can go on the Grasslands Roadmap website. You can also, I'll give you Graham's, the coordinator's contact if you want to see the JV8 strategy if you haven't seen it yet. But they really want to focus on accelerating successful conservation actions, building on what the joint ventures already do, but growing that, building a conservation overview of central grasslands, a collective landscape description that addresses maps and threats and actions, and also gaps. Also marketing and fundraising, be a voice, elevate the efforts of JVs and others, identify and support policy changes that advance grassland conservation, federal, state, and donors, building support and funding to make this happen, promoting applied research to answer key questions, optimize conservation action, and make sure we're driven by the best available science. And then, of course, innovation and new initiatives, develop new approaches, explore new tools. And again, I think Graham's on the call today, but here his contact information. Also, the prime supporters, investors for this effort are the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and ConocoPhillips. So a little bit more here, the roadmap in JV8, we actually worked with a diverse team from the roadmap effort, and we pulled together, this is the geography we're trying to focus on. It builds in on the JV8 boundaries, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, as well as the bird conservation region maps. And as you can see here, the JV8 coordinator is on the planning team, and we have 2 JV coordinators also on the planning team. And also, what we're trying to do is work together to help leverage JV8 efforts across the 8 sectors. So on that idea of leveraging partnerships and dollars, obviously joint ventures have been doing this since their inception. They're leaders in bringing folks together and leveraging funds. We're also trying to get foundations to catalyze across the borders and boundaries. Instead of them working maybe sometimes in their own little space, how can they come together in broader context, realize what other foundations are doing, and hopefully catalyze their efforts and investments across borders and boundaries. Also elevating the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, their model of bringing federal, corporate, and private dollars together to get more on the ground and track outcomes. As you're aware, they now have a Northern Great Plains and a Southern Great Plains Initiative pool, so it's been great to see them expanding that geography across the JV8 and the Central Flyway. This initial idea was created through the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, the National Conservation Need, and the whole planning team helped pull that together from state agencies like Missouri and North Dakota to partners like American Bird Conservancy and Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. So now that we're working on this roadmap and getting the metrics of success and a scorecard, we have an NCN 2.0 that actually helps bring dollars to the table to make implementation possible. Also, how we can get better understanding of programs and resources that can integrate and complement efforts, and then realizing that we need to move from billions of dollars invested to billions of dollars. And as we get more confidence, more engagement, and more people see themselves as part of this and want to contribute to it, that's how we'll get there. So we want to make sure that this is an active document. It's iterative. As we go, we will continue to adapt. We want to build on the work and get closer to metrics that matter and bring us together, but ultimately stretch us. This is more than a 600 million acre landscape across 3 countries. A third of it are considered in native condition, and 2/3 are either converted or degraded through woody encroachment, invasive encroachment of annuals, or other degraded states. So it's a big lift. We ultimately wanted to get to stable populations of grassland birds, including those in greatest declines like thick-billed and chestnut-sided longspurs, to also key shorebird birds, waterfowl that bring us together. We're also recognizing these are shared landscapes that include pollinators and pronghorn. And then challenging ourselves to get beyond just changing the declines to actually quantifying the number of birds and other wildlife resources saved. Again, measures that matter with partners in the room. Water is key on the landscape, so be thinking about measures that we can track in terms of utilizing or keeping water in aquifers, or different metrics that really help capture water. Huge commitment from corporations. They want to be carbon neutral. So how do we help measure and get there with restoration and improved practices? Land health metrics that matter, from cattle gains to productivity to other cultural values, and then again, money invested from millions to billions. just wanted to highlight how the pieces and elements can fit together. We've already have the overarching goals and vision, the idea of seeing a sea of grasslands for the future, supporting human and wildlife communities. Then we need to make commitments to the goals and vision in ways that the 8 sectors can help support, and how we track these efforts and use strengths of partners to achieve, and then getting to measures of success from wildlife to grasslands to carbon, and then checking in and making sure we're on track and addressing barriers when we're not. So if you're not involved, I hope you'll check out the website and learn more, get signed up for the newsletter. If you'd like to get involved in a work group, you can reach out to me, but you can also reach out to Matt Gray. He is our facilitator that's been helping coordinate all this effort for the last 18 months and will be continuing to work with us, and he's available at info@grasslandsroadmap.org. And with that, Carolyn, I will turn it back over to you if you want to take questions.
Okay, thanks, Tammy and Christian. That was really great. So for our participants, if you have questions, you can type them into the question box that's in the dashboard. There is one question already, which is from Ian Cook. Hi, Ian. And his question is, how do Canadian organizations communicate our support for the North American Grasslands Act?
Did you want to take that quick, Christian, or do you want?
There's actually a small group formed from the PHJV to ask that question, and then internally within Environment and Climate Change Canada, there's a little interdepartmental working group forming to look at what Canada can say. I mean, this is an act in the United States, but we know that NACA, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, was huge for wetland conservation. And of course, the key mechanism was that it enabled funding to flow from the States to Canada and Mexico. And of course, that, I think we signed in '85 and Mexico joined in '94. So there is a lot of interest. And also there's a lot of wetland expertise and joint venture expertise in Canada. The Prairie Habitat Joint Venture was really there right from the get-go in the '80s in the formation of all of this. So there's a lot of experience and knowledge, and I think people are sort of trying to put together a list of lessons learned that might be informative. I would think if you have something to contribute there, any of you, that probably the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture might be the best mechanism for being a part of how Canada speaks to that. Mostly we're watching, we're looking, we're hoping, but yes, there are people interested in sharing lessons learned. And I'm actually being just asked recently to prepare a deck on this subject, which should be seen by my assistant deputy minister. That for me is super exciting. So maybe, maybe this will get elevated in Canada as well, but it's a US act. So things have to happen in the US.
Okay, thank you. Cliff has a question, Cliff Wallace. He is asking, who is leading the Mexico discussions?
So there is a group there, including Humberto Berlanga and David Bori and Arvind Punjabi and Irene. So if you want to reach out to any of them, or if you want to contact me, I can help put you in touch with the group that's helping with Mexico.
Yeah, and Cliff, I will add that I can also share those contacts within our group, as we work with the Mexicans as well. Cliff is a star on our team in the Canadian working group.
He's a star on the Transboundary Grasslands Partnership too. The next question is from Rebecca. Do you have a working group focused on soil health assessment and restoration? We
currently do not have one focused on soil health, But if that's something that we think a working group could get formed on, be more than happy to help make that happen and work through the facilitator to look at how we could structure that.
Okay, so those are all the questions that have come in. If anyone else would like to ask one, please feel free. We've had a few discussions in our Transboundary Grasslands partnership core team about how the TGP fits within these working groups or within these initiatives, and how to contribute without duplicating efforts. Do you have anything to offer in terms of guidance for the TGP as well as other groups that might be wanting to contribute as well?
You want to start, Christian?
Sure, I just have to find my mute and unmute. Well, first thing I would say is, that is the question, and I really think we need to be rowing in parallel. So you need to keep on doing what you're doing, which is so awesome. So that's the first part of the answer. And I've been inspired by Transboundary stuff for a long time. The other thing that we can do, and which we are doing, is having liaison. So Kevin is on the Canadian working group and has been, a big part of the summit. So we do have those lines of communication open in that way. And I'm certainly open to, being more involved in Transboundary if you feel that's useful as well. I think you're entitled to ask the question of how can it help us. So I think you have very real, very spatially explicit, on the ground projects, people, long-term relationships. So I think you're entitled to ask the question of how can the bigger summit help us, and what are the opportunities? I think some of the communication opportunities exist, and Cliff can also has a great liaison there. So where we maybe can pool some resources and looking and hoping for opportunities there, or maybe just the alignment with the summit will help you in some fundraising efforts of your own. I think the more we show that we're working in parallel with these things, each of those groups will benefit from that. This is really not about replacing regional groups in any means of at all. PCAP and the Prairie Conservation Forum and all of those things are so important. But maybe I keep returning to that squeakier wheel analogy, that it's helped us get some funds out the door. So I think it maybe we can discuss that. And I'm sort of giving you a bit of a Canadian answer here. I'm going to leave the bigger international answer to Tammy, but I want to just say one little thing, and that is what I particularly like about this approach of the summit is that we sort of got together with all these diverse processes and diverse voices, and we're still figuring it all out. This is why 2 years in, we're now having 2 or 3 days of meetings looking at metrics and the grassland scorecard and all that developed. This is as a result of all that diverse input from 350 delegates or more. And I've worked a lot in conservation planning, and I've been involved in a lot of conservation business plans and other things. And I always find we set our targets and our strategies early on with our core teams, and then we invite stakeholders to comment. And I find this way, I find it just much more diverse and inclusive and engaging, and I love a lot messier, to be honest. But we have to embrace that, because that's exactly what we're going to need. And it's in particular in grasslands, where it's just so interdisciplinary, for want of a better word. Like, it's so, it needs agriculture, it needs all the 8 sectors that Tammy spoke to. It needs all of those indigenous-led conservation initiatives and indigenous voices. At the same time, we have all these other groups, landowner groups, industry groups. All of these things working in parallel is incredibly messy. So the most we can do is elevate each other's voices and try to work in parallel as best we can. I hope that answers your question, Carolyn. I'll let Tammy speak to some of the international oomph to that.
Well, a few things come to mind. I'm certainly happy to explore more, but I do hope that your group has looked at the roadmap and the 12 priorities. You can see in terms of partnerships and engagement, policy and funding, and research, what those priorities are, and connect the dots of what you're doing up to that, and then how do you scale it down to the local level. I think it would be great if the Transboundary group, they're, like you said, Kevin is on with the Canada working group, but maybe we should have an additional representative on the planning team. And also, I think it would be great in a future newsletter article to highlight the Transboundary Partnership as an example of a local collaborative, local yet regional. So certainly want to make sure that everyone's feeling connected, supported, and contributing, and ultimately benefiting from the ground level to the international level.
Okay, great, thank you. That was a great answer. There are no more questions online, but
Carolyn,
just sorry, go ahead.
I think I see Rebecca and Cliff with a little question mark beside their name. Is that correct?
Yes, and so those are the two questions that I've asked. So for the communications that you were talking about that were going to be available for everyone, so would like individuals or groups just join like your newsletter to get access to that?
So you can get the newsletter by just basically reaching out to info@grasslandsroadmap.org. That's Matt Gray. But if you want to join the communications planning team, again, reach out to Matt at info@grasslandsroadmap.org, and then you can join that team. It's open, and we actually have landowner on it. We have NRCS, Fish and Wildlife Service. We have World Wildlife Fund, Bird Conservancy, and Audubon Rockies, and I think a few others. So it is open, and they're working towards getting more of a urban, suburban communications messaging out with a graphic that really helps depict our grasslands. We also have a Cornell Lab of Ornithology helping by early next year. So I think it would be great if you knew of a few folks that you would like to layer in to that.
Okay, that sounds great. And just for like my own personal, because we also do communications and general awareness and things like that. Do you have a strategy on determining whether the communication strategy is effective in informing people?
I think that's an excellent point, and we do want to make sure that what we're putting together will be relevant. I think this forum that we're going to pilot in Colorado will actually help reinforce what people are asking and what they're responding to help validate some of the messaging we're trying to put out. But that team, again, is communicators, so I think that will be high on their list and radar to make sure that we're not just throwing stuff out and making sure it is effective and resonating.
Awesome. So Kelsey Olson asked, she just wanted to confirm that the email address is info@grasslandsroadmap.org.
Yes, yes, and the person's name is Matt. So if you put in that email and then just say, "Hi, Matt," that'll make you feel like you're actually talking to a human being.
Sounds good, instead of just saying, "Hi there."
Yeah.
Okay. So that's all we have for this for questions. Thank you so much for your time this morning, and your presentation was really great. We have some time before our next presentation at 10:15. So, which is good, we're not rushed. Sasha, did you want to do another poll now while we have time?
Sure, yeah, let's do that. The next poll that I'm going to load is just kind of who you represent, kind of the best classification for who you're affiliated with. I didn't know really how to word that question, but I think you'll get it once I put up the poll. Yeah, so go ahead and answer that while we fill some time here.
Thanks, Sasha.
I'm going to go on mute, Carolyn, but thank you again, Sasha, Carolyn, and Christian. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Tammy. Okay, so for the results of this poll, so non-government organization has 47%. 6% are producers, which is great to have you guys here. 20% is provincial or municipal government. 17% is federal government, and 10% is other. And so about 72% of our participants voted. So it's great to see who you guys represent. That's really awesome. So I think since we don't have like bathroom breaks worked into the schedule, I think we will maybe have one now, but we have time to spare. So if you guys want to go have a snack or go to the bathroom, you can do that now, and we will come back with the next presentation at 10:15. You don't have to leave or anything like that or disconnect. You can just walk away and come back. We'll see you in 8 minutes. Okay, welcome back. It is 10:15. I hope everyone had a good little break and got to stretch your legs. Our next presentation this morning is about the USDA's NRCS's first ever grassland biome conservation framework with Durak Tidwell. So just a bit about our presenter this morning. Durak Tidwell is an associate professor at the University of Nebraska, a science advisor for the USDA NRCS in the Great Plains, and a national science team member for a new Great Plains grassland strategy under NRCS Working Lands for Wildlife. His program focuses on relatively simple changes in rangeland vegetation, or how relatively simple changes in rangeland vegetation affect societal well-being. So his research has shown how natural disasters, collapses in rural livelihoods on working rangelands, the depletion of grassland diversity, social programs like school funding, and the loss of unique cultural heritage are all threatened by the erosion of resilience in rangelands due to woody plant encroachment, which is very cool. Dr. Tidwell has produced a unique series of large-scale experiments with private landowner groups across the Great Plains to create novel solutions to address rangeland threats, improve grassland conservation outcomes, and support agency decision-making at regional and national scales. He is well-published with over 85 peer-reviewed publications in outlets like Science, Nature journals, the PNAS, and he has been an investigator on nearly $25 million in funding since joining the University of Nebraska in 2013. So we are very lucky to have Durak here today. So if you wanted to get started, you should check if we can hear you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sasha. And yeah, honors all mine. I mean, I love discussions and groups like this that are trying to think of how to conserve, big and iconic grasslands at large scales. And so I'm really pleased and honored to be learning a lot about this Transboundary Grasslands partnership. I think there's a lot of great opportunities to share lessons learned and stories from groups that are really trying to scale up how we manage and conserve our grasslands, especially for the groups that are tied to the land today. And it's great seeing some of the producer groups that are here because we all get paid to come to meetings and talk. So thanks for that 6% that I saw in that survey for being here as well. To me, I think that's one of the most important things we can all be doing. Awesome following Tammy and Christian, and I thought that was just a great lead in terms of this session, a little bit on the global vision. And so I'm going to share a little bit behind the USDA NRCS's first ever grassland biome conservation framework and share some of the science and technology behind it, because we expect that science and technology to grow and meet some of the needs and capacity of even groups like this or in Mexico and Canada. And it gives us awesome opportunity, like I said, of being able to share what's working and really how we scale up to deal with the kind of threats we're going to be facing this century. So I really like always starting here because this is how I communicated the challenges we had ahead of us a couple years ago. And it was really trying to build awareness on what was coming in the Great Plains and just the scales of the challenge that we have as a conservation community and how that's going to affect rancher livelihoods and people that depend on the land. And across the world, what we're seeing today is it's not just a regime shift or state transitions where you go from the ecosystems of old and that have been here for a long time to a very novel ecosystem and that could severely impact, societal and human well-being. And a big difference in that work is that we often view it kind of outside our vehicle window or when we're standing out there, on the land, and we see these kind of changes like a grassland going to a woody-dominated state or a coral reef that becomes algal-dominated and unproductive, or in the Great Plains like the Dust Bowl in the past where we saw this kind of erosion that occurred at large scales. And I think that's that story of what we now know in the science, is that it's not just about critical transitions that occur, it's about the scale at which those transitions occur. So the ones that we start to become most concerned about are when they transcend the scales of the past. It's not just erosion, right? We start having multi-scale erosion, and we're concerned about that kind of desertification and what that means. We're concerned about entire coral reef collapse today. And we're concerned about what's happening in the Great Plains biome and frankly, grasslands and savanna biomes across the world in terms of things like woody encroachment. It's not just, right, a local patch or a local property. We're now tracking woody encroachment across multiple states and in the entire interior of the continent. So things that transcend scale, you know, those tend to have the biggest impact on human well-being, because large scale systems have still been relatively stable, even with all of human intensification over the past century or two. But what I really like is that kind of message and all the data that was with it in terms of the awareness campaign, you know, 2021 really is turning to action. And that's exciting to see. And I think that's what Tammy was laying out so well with Central Grasslands Roadmap. You're seeing it with JV8, and you're seeing it with a number of other organizations of starting to think at larger scales. And that's one of the biggest criticisms for grassland conservation, especially here in the United States, is that we've had a very local viewpoint and strategy of how we manage our grasslands. And so what you're seeing here on the left is actually a framework for conservation action that was released by the NRCS Working Lands for Wildlife in about a year ago. It was late 2020. And what that does is mirror some of the success of the sagebrush biomes effort and the sage grouse initiative. And this really provides a framework that's meant to recognize biome scale threats, identify where we have intact landscapes, and of course, with this being Working Lands for Wildlife, where they have wildlife strongholds that occur at large scales that need that kind of conservation effort. But that third bubble there, that cultural will to act, and where those three things align, that's where we're really seeing larger scale conservation efforts work. And this is the NRCS's contribution to some of those partnership efforts, like that Central Grassland Roadmap, which is important to recognize here, because when we're talking private lands, you know, we start talking about the power of the Farm Bill as being the predominant way that conservation has been incentivized in the past, and how to start to continue to scale that up as we move forward in a private lands dominated biome. And it's no wonder why, when we're talking about the things we're talking about today, and we talk about this century, you know, the 3 billion birds that came out in Science, and, you know, we know the grassland birds globally and here in North America are some of the fastest declining. And then also we can start tying this to working lands. And so when you're talking about the Great Plains, you're also talking about the factory that drives, you know, agricultural production. And if we can start to align those, the power we have from a conservation sector becomes huge. And that's what this strategy is meant to do. Sustainable agriculture and sustainable conservation, which has been one of our biggest challenges here in this region. Now, as a scientist, we're just in, you know, it's easy to see where we fit. And that's what excites me of these efforts, is that I've often communicated that the efforts in the Great Plains is often like the Wild Wild West, because it's so private lands dominated, because we've lacked the workforce of maybe more populated regions. And often what that means is we're kind of like a fractured mirror in conservation support. You know, we have all the pieces in place, but it's been really hard to bring all these things together in a way that can really benefit producers on these lands and can really benefit our outcome goals. And what I've really liked about being part of this National Working Lands for Wildlife science team is just seeing how rapidly the group has gone through iterations like this, where we have a biome framework for conservation action, and that really drives the technology that's needed in order for us to support the implementation of those frameworks. And so you're seeing how framework guides technology and how that guides implementation and actual conservation on the ground. And that drives outcomes that we measure in terms of the science. And so we're seeing much more integrated approach that rapidly goes through this cycle where those future outcomes then drive what's in the framework. And I'm going to show you some of those examples today. But it's just amazing seeing how fast some of the science with these frameworks, technology is really increasing implementation. This postcard you're seeing from Kansas down here in the lower right, this is how Kansas responded to these kind of frameworks and technology. And that's a postcard for scaling up conservation on the ground. Nebraska then released a Great Plains Grassland Initiative earlier this fall. And we just finished statewide training for the entire USDA and a bunch of partners on how to scale up what we're doing. South Dakota did their first internal launch October 7th. So you're actually seeing this drive huge amounts of implementation. And what that means for us on the back end is that we need to measure those so we can communicate why this approach and these approaches are working. That's been exciting to see as a scientist, because often this process is so slow. Now, these initiatives and efforts in the Great Plains that are tied to this framework and what I just mentioned tied to those various states, this is the first time we've really seen where we prioritize biome scale threats as the top threats that get addressed. And we now have the data to do that. So we can track what are the primary drivers of grassland loss that are occurring in the Great Plains. This is a paper in review by some friend and colleagues that we work often with at the University of Montana. They're also part of that National Working Lands for Wildlife Science team. And what you're seeing here is that land use conversion and woody encroachment are now occurring at the same rate. So often in the northern regions, people know a whole lot about land use conversion, but maybe don't know just the story of the southern half of the Great Plains and how that's changing and coming into the northern regions. And those are now converting land at the same rate. So if you take this map that was generated by WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, this map's a great map of just showing where this high cultivation risk exists, right, relative to low cultivation risk. And no secret to this group and a lot of areas in the northern Great Plains, those areas that haven't been cultivated yet are low cultivation risk. You take the moderate to higher, 70% of that land has already been cultivated. So our most intact grassland regions today are those that have escaped the history of agricultural conversion. And they continue to be threatened, of course, by that, and it's a major and important focus. But notice in the southern half of the Great Plains, everywhere that has low cultivation risk has trees in it. And I'll give you some data on just how much that continues to put pressure. And I now get calls from South Dakota, North Dakota. We have data showing the earliest signs of encroachment in Wyoming, and we have calls coming in from Montana that's related to this group of how woody encroachment's changing. And you see maps like this, right? We want to prevent large-scale transitions at all costs because we know how hard it is to get that back. So this is a really great opportunity to learn the lessons of some of those other regions as just part of this bigger strategy of how we address the top two threats to the biome. If you combine them, this is what that starts to look like. So this was something that we did with some of the WWF science team as well. And this gives a really nice overview based on some of the information we have of, you know, these intact grassland areas and the need to start putting those on the map because we don't want to take those for granted in terms of what's playing out now. You can see areas like this transboundary effort where there's this at-risk to cultivation driving a lot of that. And those are what's shown in the yellow. So across the whole Great Plains, we're talking about 100 million acres that in this kind of case are more intact, whereas you have 124 million acres that are either at risk of cultivation or using some of our products at risk of woody encroachment. The purple and what you're seeing there in black colors, those are areas that have already been hit by the tractor, or if they've not been hit by the tractor, they've been hit by the trees. Or there's some of our traditional forests that were embedded within the Great Plains. So you can really see it starts painting a different picture of just the pressures that this biome feels. I mean, this is the state of our biome, and that's why these biome conservation efforts are starting to play out. They tend to not happen until we have this level of risk that's affecting these larger order systems. Now, I think one of the big parts of this, it's really important to communicate here that we just couldn't track this until recently. We couldn't really inform the broader scale conservation community and prioritize these kind of threats and issues for different regions, especially tied to our rangelands. And that changed with the advent of things like this rangeland analysis platform. So there's a link on the lower left. And what that allows us to do is it tracks for every year, for every baseball diamond, different functional groups in rangelands. So we can now track perennials, annuals, shrubs, trees, bare ground. And those functional groups are tied to what drives state transitions in our regions, in our ecosystems. So we can actually track data of how trees are changing in the Great Plains and compare that to trends in bare ground or to annuals. And so that's what allows us to start seeing what these unintended rangeland biome scale threats are. It was much easier to track, land use conversion than it was to track these kind of types of changes in our rangelands. So a huge innovation driven by Dr. Brady Allred and a good friend out at Montana that really allows us to start putting these things and start to target better. And so it's new. And so to have this conversation already is frankly really exciting and rewarding. And I know that there's conversations of how to start expanding this kind of an approach for grasslands and our rangelands into areas of Canada and Mexico. Brady always says it'll look different because the data is different in terms of what drives it. But the ability to expand this means that we can really start to look at how these threats are playing out and provide earlier warning for the kind of things that are threatening our most intact regions. Now, you can imagine when we had this kind of data, we worked really hard to start getting this story out. And I was really impressed with how quickly NRCS state leadership responded to that kind of technology and just the trends that were occurring. So, we released that Worklands for Wildlife framework for the Great Plains biome, like I said, almost a year ago. A couple months after that, this is what the commitment was of the USDA NRCS for states in the Great Plains. So we're talking about 10 million acres committed overnight. And from my standpoint, I expect this to grow as we start to show success. And what you're seeing here is, of course, we started to show this increased data of woodland encroachment or woodland expansion or woody plant encroachment. And we started to show how we could scale up our money to get after this before it became so expensive. And that's what really starts driving these increased acres. And of course, land use conversion becomes the other big threat that's tied to our biome, and another stage of commitment of how to strategically work on that threat as well. So a huge commitment overnight tied to the Farm Bill. I mean, we're talking about 10 million acres, under a biome framework, and that being one of the big contributions of the NRCS to the Central Roadmap, Central Grasslands Roadmap. So I'm going to break these two down a little bit and walk into what we've learned and how we approach this. So of course, with land use conversion, and this is in that framework, I'll give a link to it at the end, but we primarily dealt with that through the Conservation Reserve Program. And there's always this kind of stories. I took this off of a Montana, I think it was a Pheasants Forever magazine, but life after CRP, this classic line. And the reason is because it's just one of the challenges of this kind of agricultural retirement program of CRP is that it just seems to perpetually get put back under the plow based on how incentives and policies change. And the benefits, though, are huge. I mean, since 1985, this has been a great way for us to re-incentivize grassland conservation to get it reestablished in regions. There's been a $2 billion infusion from set-aside payments into these more rural communities as a result of the Conservation Reserve Program. And then you get these really incredible outcomes. One of my favorite here is this last bullet point you're seeing there out of a recent study by David Pavlaki and colleagues, where they showed in the Southern Great Plains, CRP helped conserve 4.5 million songbirds. It actually met the recovery goal for 8 species, right? Like those are the kind of outcomes that we're looking to be able to sustain long-term but also create as we start scaling up grassland conservation efforts. But the outlook's still concerning when it comes to these kind of programs, because our acreage exiting CRP is still, one of the largest sources of grassland loss here in the United States. We still lose 1 million acres of grassland annually to cropland conversion. Competition to stay in the program becomes really high, and it's intense because we have declining federal acreage caps on the program. And what we're seeing, though, is some of the new science that's coming out showing that more than half of willing landowners are unable to re-enroll their expiring fields. So this kind of pros versus cons is one of the big things in this framework of how can we start to address those long term. And this is, again, think of that iteration I showed you before of how frameworks, modern technology, implementation drive outcomes. This is an example of a paper that I pulled from Western Kansas. And it's just a great example of how this kind of feeds this machine and how outcomes can drive what's in the framework. So one of these recent studies really was showing with this modern technology that 58% of CRP was retained a decade after contract expiration. So you're seeing a high rate of landowner interest, and those were really occurring in areas that were more tied to these larger intact landscapes that have a grazing culture or a working lands culture. Basically, when it comes from a set-aside program like CRP, there's the opportunity to turn it into working lands. And so where do you see that? You see it almost twice as high in these lower productivity landscapes, because those are landscapes that can be put back into working rangelands. And so that kind of spatial targeting, not only up front of where CRP might be really useful for conservation goals, but also for long-term sustainability, so that they don't just get plowed over again in that perpetual cycle we've seen in the past. So just that's in the framework, actually trying to target those areas and retain them long-term. The NRCS's approach is actually to, because the FSA is the group that actually implements CRP, NRCS is looking now to be able to identify ways with minimal investments of water or fencing, what kind of grazing infrastructure does a local landowner need to be able to put that back into working rangelands and be part of their operation? That's a huge part of this effort going forward, because we know it's likely to be there long term. And I just really like what that drives in terms of our thought process. It's not just a local outcome and a local benefit. By having that kind of initial investment in the ranching community, we start seeing these benefits transcend to really reach systems level outcomes. And so you start talking about space for young new ranching families where that's currently limited space. You start talking about enhanced grazing receipts and profitability associated with these programs. Of course, by preventing the perpetual plow turning over CRP land, we're talking about continuing to sequester that carbon long term instead of just a very transient effect with carbon sequestration in the program. Of course, targeting in key areas allows us to maintain wildlife habitat migration pathways, and that's actually a current level of work that I know the science team is doing now to actually show how CRP's contributed to it. And it really becomes a better communications pathway and a better success story on how grassland conservation can start to scale up instead of just, say, postage stamp CRP efforts in the past, really seeing how they drive the system level benefit and outcomes. And so this is where we're going, and what we expect to be able to show as we're able to better target through these frameworks, the technology, improved implementation, and being able to quantify the outcomes on the back end. Now, of course, we've had some cool and really exciting success stories come out of how we've managed land use conversion in the Great Plains and the scale at which we've been able to implement things like CRP. But in the Great Plains, one of the wood encroachment's been the opposite. Until recently, we actually had 0 examples of large-scale success stories in the Great Plains on this issue. A lot of people in the northwestern part of the Great Plains might be more familiar with cheatgrass. In the rest of the Great Plains, this is our cheatgrass. In both of those cases, those are driving huge scales of state transitions and large scale success stories are incredibly rare. As a historian of the scientific literature, you don't see it. It's that rare. So large scale woody encroachment is one of those transitions that clearly is not to be messed with. And what really excites me is that we're turning that table. We know as we go forward this decade, we're going to start being able to produce the kind of outcomes that you hear people talk about with land use conversion as we work together in collaborative efforts. This guide you're seeing on the right is a new guide that has contributions from university extension throughout the entire Great Plains. It empowers producer groups and empowers our conservation agencies to be able to get ahead of the woody encroachment problem, really overcome the current shortcomings in our rangeland management paradigm on this issue, and win. It just hit us like a brick wall a couple years ago of what we missed and how to start putting this in a framework to approach it. So I'm going to break this down a little bit more in this group of how we're actually starting to be able to work through reducing woody encroachment and better managing the risk that we're facing. So this, with the modern technology and the rangeland analysis platform, I always start here. The Farm Bill has, spent a huge amount of dollars in the Great Plains for decades doing what's called brush management. It's one of the most expensive things we do in grassland conservation efforts. And we spent $177 million alone in the last Farm Bill just on brush management. And what you're seeing here is basically it comes from new scientific metrics where we can track the boundaries of large-scale alternative states. So this century, scientists expect biomes to collapse and reorganize. So what you're seeing here are alternative biome states. And here on the western side, that's the western edge of the Great Plains. Everywhere blue is more grassland dominated. Everywhere red, like the Black Hills, or here's Halsey National Forest, where we planted like a couple, it's about 26,000 acres of cedar hand-planted forest. So everywhere red on this map looks more like those kind of woody dominated systems like this lower right picture than it does like our grassland dominated systems. And everywhere yellow that you're seeing here is where those two do not coexist and is providing early warning for potential transitions at large scales. Now, we don't care if our biomes are stable, right? They've been stable since the last ice age, but we care if we can track their collapse. So that's 2018. And I'll just pause in case there's a little bit of lag here. But when we're talking about Great Plains grassland biome conservation, I mean, no doubt about it, this group that's on this call is faced with an unprecedented challenge of biome collapsing while we're professionals working on these issues. In 20 years, half of my lifetime, look at how much that biome's moved. All of a sudden, the Flint Hills of Kansas, which burns about 2 million acres a year, the last tallgrass prairie ecoregion in North America, they look like a paleo relic like the Black Hills. That's how fast this starts to move, and they made it flinch. We're now working with hundreds of thousands of acres in this area to show why it hasn't been more successful in that area and how to better manage that risk. Now, we spent $177 million chasing this problem in the red at 5 to 10 to 20 acres at a time because we didn't have this information. What if we spent that money getting ahead of large-scale transitions and large-scale threats? Would this have been more successful and would we be in a better position? And I think that's even part of the story throughout the entire Great Plains is we want to provide as early warning as possible to get ahead of transitions that are so severe they affect our entire societal well-being and in ways that we just wouldn't have predicted. So given that this is often talked about from wildlife groups first, one of the key points and lines is that these transitions serve as early warning for grassland wildlife. So this is actually data from Kansas, and we had a previous paper in Nature Climate Change showing how these bird regimes are changing along with these kind of large scale transitions. But basically we have increasingly wildlife that are having increasingly unsafe operating space or unusable habitat space as these transitions are playing out. So we don't want to wait until they crash and we're able to really document those changes to initiate these kind of large scale efforts. We want to get ahead of them and prevent those types of critical transitions from collapsing some of our last important, iconic wildlife. In this case, this is the greater prairie chicken, the last prairie chicken, not to have some point gone extinct or listed under the Endangered Species Act here in the US. So we know that. This is actually a paper coming out in Ecological Applications of just the kind of severity that these play in terms of our grassland wildlife. We actually have similar data in Wyoming on pronghorn and what the earliest stages of encroachment means there. So the earlier we can act, the further we can get ahead of these types of big changes, and the more that we can reinforce our wildlife strongholds given the threats coming this century. Now, I wish it just stopped there, and I wish it was just a wildlife problem, but it's not. What we're talking about with large-scale collapse are system-level consequences that no one would have predicted. Now, in the Great Plains, people have studied the consequences of woody encroachment for decades. So when I started in Nebraska, it's like, what else should we look at that we wouldn't have thought to look at? What we're talking about is, when we talk about things like eastern red cedar or woody encroachment, up to or more than 75% of a producer's livelihood gets affected as we have a change from grassland to woody dominance. And it's not just that. If you care about grassland biodiversity and maybe it's plant diversity, we see that collapse. If it's grassland dependent wildlife or things like the previously endangered American burying beetle, those collapse. Large scale migrations associated with large mammals are affected. The prairie chickens I mentioned, but it goes beyond that. We don't have a wildfire problem that matches the western portions of the United States here in the Great Plains, but we've published and shown how it's growing, and it's growing with this large-scale biome transition that's following volatile species associated with things like eastern red cedar and other juniperous species. It's not just that, we've tracked it to changes in the hydrologic function of our systems and water. It's not just that, we're tying it to school funding, where millions of acres in the Great Plains that go to fund public education in schools are affected because there's grazing revenue off leased land where all the profits go to funding of public education. This is what collapse in ecosystem services look like, and we expect that to happen when our biomes have this kind of pressure. So this is truly what groups like this are up against and what's coming. So the more that groups are prepared, like this group, in terms of being able to reinforce the cultural identity and will of a region and get ahead of it, the more that we expect those will be some of our last big iconic grasslands that are left. Now, this is what data we had, and all this stuff was things that we've published in terms of communicating this issue. And what I like is that we know we see groups turning the tide. So I'm gonna give one example of a success story of many that we see coming. So this is an example of a landowner group who actually came together in the early 2000s and really started getting after it in 2005, where they've now grown collaborations in a 330,000 acre ecoregion to the majority of the region on private lands. And that's kind of that holy grail, right? Like, how can we reinforce on private lands the scaling up of conservation because so many people own it? This is an example of it. They now have cultural will on over 200,000 acres of a 330,000 acre ecoregion. And watch how this plays out over time as we better target this process. So same thing, this is kind of a zoomed in from that biome view. The woody dominated state, in this case driven by eastern red cedar or Juniperus virginiana. Everywhere that's red is dominated by eastern red cedar. Everywhere blue is our grassland dominated areas. And so just watch how this plays out. Watch how this plays out over time as this really ramps up. So that's 2000. That's 2005. This is 2010, and this is what we see everywhere in the Great Plains on this issue. And there's 15, 16, 17, and 2018. And when I've shown this to landowner groups all across now the Great Plains, it feels like when we see these kind of regional scale transitions be halted, some of the quotes are, like, finally somebody's winning the war in terms of losing our broader, more intact regions. Because realize, once you're part of a woody dominated state, your management costs go up. It's so hard to get it back. You're part of a woody dominated system. Our fundamental way we can try and conserve these becomes more expensive and changes. Well, here's where they have all their management. and see how it's on the boundary. It wasn't on the interior chasing an alternative state into our intact desired state. They operate at the boundary and got ahead of it and are waging war at that level. And that's one of the reasons they won. They weren't chasing the problem and waiting to act. They were getting out in front of it, and they were getting out in front of it at scale through partnerships. And so just really impressive watching this roll out. And where we see groups doing this, we're seeing more and more patterns of large scale conservation winning against biome scale threats. And they prioritize this threat over anything else. Sure, they have local grazing concerns, but those grazing concerns aren't a concern anymore if you lose this to woody dominated state. Sure, they have issues with local weeds, but those local weeds aren't a bigger threat than woody transitions. If they have those local concerns, that's great. We want to keep it that way. And people here in the southeastern portion of the region can thank all these landowners here that they don't have a woody problem that they're having to manage yet. It's such a new way of thinking of how to deal with large scale transitions and how to conserve our biome against it. So what have we been able to track? Well, we've been able to track the opposite of what we saw happening all over the Great Plains. We have rare success in halting a regional scale transition. In fact, this is the first example we know with woody encroachment at these scales anywhere in the Great Plains. They have more forage production, which drives their livelihood on those areas. It protects 87% of the previously endangered American bearing beetle because they live where they're doing that management or where lands are protected because those woody plants haven't come in yet. It's reducing wildfire danger and it's preventing loss from revenue on school lands where that goes to public education here. So we're starting to see system level outcomes, right? And that's what happens as we start to scale it up and get ahead of it. This is really driving the Working Lands for Wildlife effort here of just defend the core, grow the core, get out ahead of these bigger issues. What we did in the past under the NRCS and under the Farm Bill is we were really good ambulance drivers and we reacted once there became a problem. You just can't do that for biome type of threats. That works really well for local threats. So we want to do more preventative care, right? We want to get ahead of these issues so it fundamentally doesn't change our way of life. And we keep these areas here on the right and not wait to act before we see those areas on the left. Now, let me show you a little bit of what this is starting to look like for us. In terms of this guide is driving that Working Lands for Wildlife framework where we want to better manage sensitivity and reduce exposure. We never reduced exposure. We basically said, it's okay to have all these seed-bearing trees here, right? It'd be like saying it's okay to have cheatgrass right next door. Just manage the problem. That's what we did with woody encroachment. And what we've learned is that exposure is actually more important than even how we try and manage it. So we're putting this framework into practice at large scales because it just is more economical, it's more effective, it works better. And adaptive capacity are basically like our partnerships, our cost share, our incentivizations. This is that big box of what the Central Grasslands Roadmap was talking about earlier, of how we can help private landowners actually scale up so that they're not just by themselves dealing with these kind of big issues. Where we see groups winning is where we're reducing risk and vulnerability, and we're doing it based on the fundamental biology of how encroachment happens. So it's not like land use conversion where we're just purposefully turning over land and then purposefully pulling it back out again. Woody encroachment happens because mature plants produce a seed that produces seedlings. And what happens over time is that intact acres become contaminated, by seed dispersal and by recruitment. If you don't manage that, what happens? It becomes future expansion and future encroachment. And what we found in areas of the Great Plains, like in the Sandhills of Nebraska, is that 95% of recruitment happens within 2 football fields of a seed source, so about 200 meters. And if we don't manage that, every time you don't manage that seed-bearing leading edge, you're losing football fields. So we want to anchor to our intact areas, to our intact cores, and then push against that. Literally the opposite of what we did with hundreds of millions of dollars of Farm Bill and USDA expenditures. And we can better target that way to where we're actually defending these areas and moving against it. Now this sounds like such an obvious change, but we just fail to act on large scale changes over and over and over again. And with threats like this one, we just don't want to wait to see that materialize. Now, what we have is we have data across the entire Great Plains of what that vulnerability looks like. So that table that you just saw, these green areas are what look intact in places like South Dakota. And we have a Worklands for Wildlife reporting mechanisms that's going to show this, and where producers can go to it and actually see what's playing out. Everywhere yellow on this map is where it looks treeless, right? But it's within that 2 football fields of a seed source. So they're the areas where we expect future encroachment to start playing out. And we should just keep our eyes on it and make sure that that's not happening. Everywhere red is where we would have managed in the past. We wouldn't have even touched the yellow. And what's happening is we keep losing productivity. So South Dakota didn't think they had this problem, yet they lost 170,000 tons of productivity in 2019 because it just keeps slowly taking land out of agricultural production and wildlife habitat. Now, of course, Nebraska used to look like South Dakota. And the Sandhills is one of the most intact true prairies in the world. And we lost in this state 530,000 tons of productivity. And I can now show industry what's happening in every single county in the state of Nebraska. And of course, this is a huge hit for our industry and also our wildlife habitat. Now, of course, Kansas used to look like Nebraska. And Kansas lost greater than 2 million tons of productivity in 2019 due to woody encroachment. And Oklahoma used to look like Kansas. And they lost 7 million tons. And we never managed the yellow. We never kept our big intact areas intact. And I think that's what we're all talking about here, right? Regardless of the big threats that are pushing this century, we have to start reinforcing the cultural will and that heritage that exists in our most intact grasslands if we're going to be successful in the coming decades. No group has just had this kind of pressure before, and we haven't had the kind of science to do this well. So this is a better foundation for our conservation groups and our landowners to win. This is an example for that South Dakota. This is how we communicate big ag in the Great Plains. We had, how much grass do we grow in rangelands? Nobody could tell me that. And what we did was communicate, 400 pounds per square foot or something. We'd look at little quadrats. When we talk about it now, we're talking about 270,000 tons was produced in this county in South Dakota. And that county lost 11,000 tons, a little over, to woody encroachment. And what that is it's called a yield gap in agriculture. So what we want to do is avoid yield gaps, right? We want to avoid losses in habitat. We don't want to wait until we see this at large scales. So we can start giving these counties warning that, whoa, you don't want to be, right now you're at 2,000 to 4,000. We don't want to be 20,000 to 40,000 like certain counties in Kansas and Nebraska. And they're using that to start getting ahead of it. So we can just better communicate our whole effort and probably do things like Central Grasslands Roadmap is talking about, better market, better fund for what this big picture is. It doesn't just affect our wildlife. It's water, it's natural disasters, it's agriculture when we're talking about these kind of things. So this message of defend the core, grow the core, I just really like this visual. This is from the Sandhills. And this is me flying over in a plane, the edge of our biome that's coming. This is where our intact Sandhills is meeting the woody dominated transitions playing out. And this is where we would have barely put dollars in before. We would have said, oh, look at this area on the right. It's intact, it's treeless, it's great. In reality, it's not. Those are seed contaminated acres. And if we don't work there, we just chase this into intact acres. And this is really a process that we should be thinking about for all invasive species that threaten our ecoregions at large scales. How do we get ahead of how it spreads spatially? We have data products that can start informing where that's happening and that are going to continue to play out. And prioritizing our management based on those invasive species that are going to lead to the biggest consequences because we don't have infinite funds. So defending our core areas and growing against them, such a nice way of twisting how we've approached this in the past and reinforcing the mission of this group. And I guess that's where I'll largely end, is that the Great Plains still has some of the most intact grasslands remaining in the world. We have a paper in review where we use WWF ecoregions and actually showing, where do we have these areas that are most intact? So take Nebraska. I love this example. Central tall grass prairie, the most converted ecoregion for prairies in the world, for true prairies. And right next to that is the Nebraska Sandhills, the most intact true prairie in the world. It won't be, right? it won't be long term because of what's playing out. And we spend a ton of time focusing on what was converted instead of what was intact. We haven't reinforced those kind of cultural intact areas. So what an opportunity ahead of us, given what we see that's threatening these larger and more intact ecoregions. And that's what this is all about. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this example in Montana, where this is what was featured as a success story in Working Lands for Wildlife Spotlight, and really identifies how we can scale this up. And this was with land use conversion, just an amazing story. The same with that Les Canyon story. This is what it's all about, reinforcing the people that we have a job because they're able to sustain their way of life on this land and what that means. So I hope we keep coming back to these success stories and really supporting them as part of this big picture. So I'll end there. There's some additional links that I'll leave up so that people can see some additional information. And just thanks for helping provide some of the vision for this effort. And hopefully I can just be a big cheerleader for what you all are doing and add it to part of our story of how people are winning at large scales and conserving big grasslands. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Duroc. That was an awesome presentation. I love seeing when data can inform management. That's awesome. So we have a few questions that we should get started on because hopefully we can get through them all. Brooke asks, does the Rangelands app extend into Canada or only cover the US? Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't want Christian to be the only one. So yeah, right now it covers the western half of the United States, but I can tell you it's being expanded, and Canada is part of that effort. Now some of the data, right, that we have available in the United States isn't the same in Canada, so that's some of what they're working through. But I would expect that, Brady Allred as kind of the point person and lead on that, just be on the heads up. That should be something I'd expect, into the nearer term than the long term in terms of having something and how that expands. But I don't want to put him under a specific timeline or gun right now. So yes, it'll expand. And I think that also there's talks of expansion into Mexico as well. So yes, and I think it's obvious why that helps us in grasslands. So I'm really excited about when it advances further beyond our northern boundary.
Yeah, I spoke to Brady this summer, and they're using a different framework for Canada than in the US, because in the US they're kind of dependent on consistent on the ground plots, which we don't have in Canada. And so he is looking for data from Canada, but it has to be in the right shape, right, for him to be able to put it into his program without having to clean it up a lot. But he is looking for data, not for this year. I think that there's a cutoff for this year, but for the next iteration of the app, which is awesome. Yeah. We can't wait.
Yeah, in the past, we created a kind of a version 1, and then as we're able to better train up models, right, it creates an even better model in version 2. So I think that's what people should probably expect.
Yeah, awesome. Marianne asks, what keeps landowners from enrolling or re-enrolling in CRP? Is it new rules that were different from when they were first enrolled?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And part of it is the competition for the program and just how things are ranked. It's intense, and you have new people that want to be enrolled versus others that maybe want to re-enroll. Also, the incentivization for conversion can be really high, right? I mean, when the market speaks as loudly as it does, you have lands that are set aside, and then all of a sudden you get really high commodity prices driving periods of large land use conversion. So the inability and lack of flexibility, right, of having something be part of working agricultural lands for producers can be big. And that's why you see in that strategy, well, instead of the only opportunity being associated with row crop agriculture in terms of the ties to commodity, if we can keep that in working grasslands, we can prevent that grass from going back under. So yeah, I mean, obviously it's complexer, but there's just so much pressure in terms of just the agricultural factory, and CRP, struggles to keep pace with that. It's a challenge.
For sure. Thank you. Sarah asks, regarding the reference to data on pronghorn responding to changes on the landscape, where can we get that, or where can that information be found?
Yeah, so I tell that snippet because what we were doing is we were using some of the data you saw today where we were screening for the very earliest signs of encroachment. And what we're doing is really warning of, if we can get on it faster, it's easy to manage. But if we wait, we see how tough it is and how many dollars we have to spend. And so we were actually screening an area in Wyoming and looking for very early warning signals of woody transitions playing out. And it's like, there's something, it's kind of like your doctor saying, I should do some more tests, right? Because it's one of our most intact grassland regions, is the Wyoming Basin Shrub Steppe. And then it's like, well, let's look into woody encroachment more specifically then. And we see some trends, but really early. And it's like, well, I wonder if somebody has data where that encroachment might be affecting some of our most sensitive species, like sage grouse or pronghorn. And so then we talked with Jeff Beck out of the University of Wyoming, and Tori Donovan, a postdoc in my lab, actually connects all those pieces together, and we start seeing where land use conversion and woody encroachment both significantly come out in the model as affecting basically population resilience associated with recruitment of pronghorn. And so that's a paper we're just getting ready to submit now. But again, it just shows why it's so important to get ahead of it and use some of these early warning indicators instead of just waiting until we feel the change, right? Or we really experience it. We're trying to get ahead of these bigger issues. And I just thought that was a nice anecdote for this transboundary effort, because we're often so late in getting ahead of big issues on invasive species until it's really hard to manage. So that we'll get that, once we get that wrapped up, we'll get that to this group as well. Because clearly it's important to be able to act on it. So that's just in the final stages.
Okay, awesome, thank you. Jessica asks, is there any thought as to, is there a line where the trees won't make it? Does the tree encroachment mapping take into consideration Russian olives? And do the southern states have a different take on tree encroachment than in the north?
The answer is yes. And so I guess to potentially all of them, so make sure I hit all these. So number one, and this is another paper that's oddly in review, but there's an old hypothesis that there's a certain level of aridity that woody encroachment can't happen beyond that point. And so what we did is we looked to see if we see the signs of encroachment happening for the first time far west of that precipitation threshold. And the answer is yes. I mean, we looked into the entire western portion of the Nebraska Sandhills, which is, a couple hundred kilometers west of that line. And we see encroachment starting to happen across the entire area. And that's one of those classic places where they said it couldn't happen. And so the first thing I guess to say is that there's so much novelty happening this century in our ecosystems. We don't want to use outdated kind of, community climax or equilibrium theory and ecology to drive our thinking. We should be looking for stages of novelty. So if we're seeing the earliest signs of encroachment, which this picture that we're looking on the screen is far beyond that, we should be changing what we're doing now because we don't want those kind of invasions playing out. So unfortunately, no, we do not see an end to encroachment. We also see where species are expanding their range, like Russian olive and others. And they might follow some things like conifer encroachment, and that makes it tougher because they're resprouting. So we always kind of laugh about the evil scientist plan, right? If you can't manage conifer encroachment that doesn't resprout, what makes you think we're going to be successful with resprouters like they have throughout Texas? It's so much harder. Well, what are we trying to do? Let's keep these big areas intact, because that way you don't have to manage every square inch of land as a high maintenance prairie, right? You want to manage that boundary of where you're getting that pressure. And that's why the Southern Great Plains has a different perspective. Their sense of urgency is totally different in terms of woody encroachment, because they've worked on this for so many decades, and they've been communicating that to the Central and Northern Great Plains for a long time. And so when we're looking at biome scale threats, the Central and Northern Great Plains should really be watching for the earliest signs of things like this woody encroachment, because once it takes off, there's no region that has successfully shown how to keep things intact, not even the Flint Hills of Kansas yet. So yeah, all three of those questions are great questions. And yes, I guess also the data does incorporate this as a collective. It's about how woody regimes overall are changing. And all I have to do is call you all or call a manager and be like, hey, what species is driving that signal? And they're like, oh, eastern red cedar or honey mesquite or Russian olive, right? Or something new I've never even heard about. So yeah, it's meant to provide that early warning signal of how the woody plant regime is changing, and couple that to local knowledge on how to manage it.
Excellent, thank you. Jessica also says that those in Montana love their olive and don't do much to get rid of it on the landscape. Have you seen that as well?
Well, of course, this is the magic. This is just those magical things or unfortunate things that happen, right? Like the Great Plains is one of the least populated regions for a reason. And so we do local improvement practices. But what happened is, in this case, a local improvement practice that we pushed since settlement of the entire region also, became the magic series of events that are ultimately helping to drive its collapse. So that's what happens in this case when we do improvement practices. This one eroded the resilience of our system. We're planting woody plants that we know are now changing and transitioning our intact Great Plains grasslands. So my big thing right now would be we shouldn't be doing certain improvement practices that erode resilience of one of the most rare ecosystems now in the world in our most intact areas. We know that they pose risk. So this risk framework says, wait a minute, if you're going to put up Russian olive or eastern red cedar or anything, we should better understand what that's going to do and now how to manage that risk. Or we shouldn't put that risk in some of our most important regions for wildlife conservation or other things. And we've conditioned over 100 years that risk was acceptable and wouldn't be a problem. And that's just changed. So our conservation community should be getting the word out. We have your back with the data, right? Like we've got 100 years of education to do without 100 years of time to do it.
It's very true. Thank you for that answer. Christian from this morning said in the chat that there's a lot going on in the sphere of grassland tracking. For example, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's team, led by Andy Davidson, it might be good for the Rangeland app team to reach out, although maybe they have already. Barry Robinson also has been doing the ground truthing work, including this past summer. So there's a connection. I think we have time for one quick question from Maggie. So much awesome science stops at the Canadian border. Thinking of journal articles that generate maps, tools for conservation efforts, the Rangeland app. Is this due to lack of data, lack of access to data, incompatibility, or what? How can we extend those research products to include the Canadian prairies? Any thoughts on that?
So I love that question, and I'll go even further. And I'm sure this resonates with you all in that are south of the border, north of the border, doesn't matter, right? Like the Great Plains, and that was that workforce comment I talked about earlier. Like as a scientist in the Great Plains, and I've worked and kind of grew up in the graduate schools of Texas A&M and Oklahoma State as well. We stop typically at our state borders usually. There's just not the competition, and there's so much pressure on us to make sure that we are meeting the needs of the state with our land grant institutions here. So when you see this, that Maggie's comment actually is like, we see where we've kind of had that fractured mirror at the state lines. We'll go from the state lines then, and we're tying this together across states. So that was what one of our first goals, was in this case. We've got to get past our political boundaries and start working across states. And we're seeing the benefits of what's playing out in terms of our frameworks, in terms of the technology, and in terms of the science. And so obviously, one of the reasons that I was really excited about this is because we can help break down those national political boundaries as well. And we just haven't had that kind of quality engagement. So I guess the answer is like, heck yeah, it's been even smaller than that. We've been confined to states and provinces because people need us to work there too. That's why these conversations and these efforts and sharing these stories and engaging are so important. And that's how we leverage data, like Christian said, and what Tammy was talking about, to start scaling up as a community. I think grasslands across the world have been plagued by that inability. So awesome comment. And I think that was a charge for everyone, not just me, but I totally agree.
Okay, that's all the time we have for you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. It was really awesome. Yeah. So next up, we have Rachel Turnquist, who will be talking about the Pan-Canadian approach.